In this video, we're going to be talking about the moral problem of terrorism. The first argument that we're going to discuss is the absolutist argument. And it goes, it is never morally permissible to intend to violently harm innocent people. Terrorism involves the intention to violently harm innocent people. Therefore, it is never morally permissible to engage in terrorism. So, are there any counters to the absolutist argument? A first counter might be that it is sometimes morally permissible to intend to violently harm innocent people. So maybe it's, in some circumstances, permissible. Maybe those circumstances involve war or some conditions of emergency where you can't help but harming innocent people. Trolley problems, for instance. A second counter might be that terrorism involves no intention to violently harm innocent people. Now, this seems obviously untrue in certain cases. Some cases of terrorism seem to involve they seem to involve spreading terror, and that would be a harm of innocent people. But maybe there are some terrorists that are more careful than that. Those terrorists maybe only try to harm guilty people, or maybe they don't try to harm anybody. Maybe they just commit acts of violence that don't cause people to be injured or die. Maybe it just destroys property, something like that. Though even those do seem like harms, but maybe they are, in some sense, not a form of harm in the same way that's meant here, which is maybe harm to the people themselves. Though this would require basically that we try to define terrorism in a way that is different from the normal colloquial definition. And the normal colloquial definition usually does seem to imply harming of innocent people. So it would be going against the grain of what we usually mean by terrorism. Though maybe there is a definition of terrorism that would be a milder version, perhaps. The next argument is the ineffectiveness argument, and it goes that an action is morally right only if it yields better results than any available options. Terrorism never yields such results. There is always an alternative to terrorism that will bring about a better outcome. So, therefore, terrorism is never morally right. So again, an argument against terrorism, but this time based in considerations of effectiveness. So what might be some counters to the effectiveness argument? A first counter might be that an action is morally right, but it will not yield better results than any available options. So maybe there are standards of rightness that depend on things other than the betterness that results from those actions. Maybe there are standards based on things like duty and things like intention that make things right regardless of yielding better results. A second counter might be that terrorism sometimes yields such results. There is sometimes not an alternative to terrorism that will bring about a better outcome. So in this argument, it's just saying, maybe in most cases, maybe terrorism is bad. Maybe terrorism's ineffective in most cases because it leads to bad results. But maybe sometimes terrorism actually does yield good results, and maybe it's the best way to get those good results. That seems like a question that is hard. It's hard to answer because we don't know necessarily like what would have happened if this terrorism had taken place versus what would have happened if the terrorism had not taken place. But we might at least imagine something like an extreme dystopian totalitarian state. What's the best way of dealing with that state? Is the best way of dealing with that state peaceful action? Or does it require terrorism in order to bring down the totalitarian state? It might not be clear in such a case. And so terrorism might, in fact, be effective in that case. Another argument is the argument from disaster prevention. So it goes, if there are any absolute moral rules, then we are never permitted to break them. Every moral rule may be permissibly broken, since doing so may be necessary to prevent catastrophe. Therefore, there are no absolute moral rules. So this is an argument that could justify terrorism because it's saying that there's no absolute moral rule against terrorism. So what might be a counter to the argument from disaster prevention? A first counter might be that there are absolute moral rules, but we are sometimes permitted to break them. This counter doesn't particularly make sense because when we talk about an absolute moral rule, we're talking about something that we are never permitted to break. So we would be changing what we mean here by an absolute moral rule. So that doesn't seem particularly like a good counter. A better counter might be that not every moral rule may be permissibly broken, since doing so may be necessary to prevent catastrophe. So, in other words, breaking moral rules might actually not be necessary to prevent catastrophe. So, breaking them is not a good idea. Breaking them doesn't have any justification. Though it does seem like this is probably false, it seems like sometimes it's possible to stop a catastrophe by breaking a moral rule. The trolley problem might be one such kind of case. We might imagine a trolley problem involving terrorism. There might be somebody who is going to blow up a city, and the only way to figure out where the bomb is to torture that person. Torturing people is a moral rule that we don't want to break, or not torturing people is a moral rule, and we don't want to break that moral rule. But if that's the only way to stop a city from exploding, then we might say, well, breaking that rule is actually permissible in order to prevent that catastrophe. Something like that. Another argument is the slippery slope argument, and it goes, if an action sets a dangerous precedent that is likely to lead to terrible long-term consequences, then it is immoral. Terrorism sets a dangerous precedent that is likely to lead to terrible long-term consequences. Therefore, terrorism is immoral. So in this case, we're saying terrorism is bad because of long-term consequences that would happen downstream of that terrorism. Basically, if everybody went around being a terrorist all the time because it was normalized, that would be a fairly bad outcome for enabling some kinds of terrorism. What might be a counter to the slippery slope argument? So a first counter might be that an action sets a dangerous precedent that is likely to lead to terrible long-term consequences, but it is not immoral. So maybe we are actually permitted to do things sometimes that might have terrible long-term consequences. A second counter might be that terrorism does not set a dangerous precedent that is likely to lead to terrible long-term consequences. Regarding this counter, it does seem worrisome. It seems like allowing terrorism might indeed set a dangerous precedent, because like we said, we don't want a world where everyone's doing terrorism all the time. That would be a fairly dangerous world. But it might be that one or two acts of terrorism don't lead to a huge influx of copycat terrorism. Maybe one or two strategic acts of terrorism can happen that don't result in massive amounts of precedent shaping. Basically, if those terrorisms can happen, for example, in secret, then it wouldn't lead to a precedent at all because it happened in secret. Though it's hard to say that terrorism can happen in secret because part of the goal of terrorism is to spread terror. So it might not be a good consideration after all to do it in secret. But these are kinds of considerations that we would have to make in order to determine whether we like or dislike this counter. Another argument is the argument from irrationality. And it goes, if perfect obedience to a rule can frustrate the underlying purpose of the rule, then the rule is irrational. Perfect obedience to an absolute ban on terrorism can sometimes frustrate its underlying purpose. Therefore, an absolute ban on terrorism is irrational. So basically, this is a rule that allows for some terrorism, but only the terrorism that does not undermine the purpose of the rule against terrorism. So what might be some counters to the argument from irrationality? Well, a first counter might be that perfect obedience to a rule can frustrate the underlying purpose of the rule, but the rule is not irrational. So this would be to advocate a kind of blind rule following that doesn't consider whether or not the purposes of the rule are actually achieved. A second counter to this argument might be that perfect obedience to an absolute ban on terrorism can never frustrate its underlying purpose. So it may be that obeying a ban on terrorism just doesn't frustrate the underlying purpose. Maybe the purpose of the ban on terrorism is to stop terror. And so obeying and never committing terrorism just does reduce terror. But it does seem like perhaps the goal of a ban on terrorism is something like safety. Now, would a ban on terrorism ever undermine the goal of safety? Well, we might imagine a case where some kind of government has made this rule in order to promote safety, but people actually aren't that safe, and the terrorism ends up drawing attention to the government's lack of safety, and that terrorism actually results in some kind of increase in safety. We might imagine a case like that. Whether or not we think a case like that is plausible might come down to the details of the case. Another argument we are considering is the war-terrorism argument. And it goes, if war can sometimes be morally justified, then so too can terrorism. War can sometimes be morally justified, therefore terrorism can sometimes be morally justified. So here we have another argument that's permissive of some terrorism, but only that terrorism that is analogous to war. What might be some counters to the war-terrorism argument? We might say that war can sometimes be morally justified, but still terrorism cannot. So maybe terrorism is different from war. Maybe war is less bad than terrorism. So terrorism can't be justified, war can. A second counter might be that war cannot sometimes be morally justified. Maybe actually we're pacifists and we don't believe that any wars are moral wars.